Hello and welcome to Indus News live from Islamabad. I'm Jawad Tehami and these are the headlines. In Afghanistan, the chairman of the Council for National Reconciliation, Abdullah, says peace talks with the Taliban will begin in September. The two sides have been at odds over several issues, including prisoners' release and reduction in violence. Pakistan has long been pushing both the sides to hold talks to reach a negotiated settlement. In New Zealand, a far-right terrorist who martyred 51 worshippers in two Christchurch mosques has been sentenced to life in prison without parole. Brenton Tarrant is the first person in the country's history to get the sentence. Earlier, Tarrant pleaded guilty to the murder of 51 people, attempted murder of another 40, and one charge of terrorism. China has urged the US politicians to stop provocation, saying Beijing will not allow Washington to cause trouble. At a briefing, Defense Ministry spokesman Wu Qian said certain US politicians are vainly trying to fuel military conflict. Beijing's statement comes after US Defense Secretary Mark Esper said China's growing military spending indicates its global ambitions. The coronavirus has infected over 24 million people, claiming more than 826,000 lives across the globe. India has recorded its highest ever daily cases with over 75,000 infections, while death toll has exceeded 60,000 mark with 1,023 fatalities. In Pakistan, the death rate continues to decline as 6 people died in the past 24 hours, taking the tally to 6,274 with over 294,000 infections. Those were the headlines and detailed stories right after a short break. Stay tuned. Welcome back, and now for the news in detail. In Afghanistan, the chairman of the High Council for National Reconciliation, Abdullah, says peace talks with the Taliban will begin in September. The long-awaited direct talks will pave the way to end the decades-long war in Afghanistan. Pakistan has been pushing both the sides to resolve difference and sit across the negotiating table. At a weekly press briefing, Foreign Office spokesman Zahid Hafiz Chaudhry said there is no military solution to the conflict. Abdullah's comments come 2 days after a high-level Taliban delegation visited Pakistan to discuss the peace process. In New Zealand, a far-right terrorist who martyred 51 worshippers in two Christchurch mosques has been sentenced to life in prison without a parole. Brenton Tarrant is the first person in the country's history to get this sentence. More in this report.
In March 2019, Brenton Tarrant brutally killed 51 worshippers at two mosques in New Zealand's city of Christchurch. The sentence announced today comes after 3 days of hearing that began earlier this week with relatives of victims giving statements in the court. Tarrant represented himself at the hearings and refused the right to address the court. Judge Mander labeled Tarrant's acts as terrorism and said his calculated mass murder requires the strictest form of punishment.
However, you are not only a murderer, but a terrorist. Your actions go further than demonstrating contempt for the sanctity of life. In the name of a political or ideological cause, you sought to violently intimidate the community and coerce the country's peaceable form of government and social order, essentially to attack New Zealand's way of life.
New Zealand's Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern expressed solidarity with the Muslim community in the country.
This has been a crime in New Zealand that has never, the likes of which has never occurred before. And now we've seen a sentence the likes of which we've never seen before as well. But yes, it gave me relief to know that that person will never see the light of day.
Crowds greeted the Christchurch mosque shooting survivors and victims' families with songs and hugs outside the city's High Court. The attack survivors were overwhelmed of the support from the public.
Thank you very much. Thank you again. You are so welcome. God bless all of us from a evil person like him. And those people try to have the same mentality and the same thinking of him. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.
Though the court verdict is a milestone for Muslims living in the West, Islamophobia still remains active in the developed nations.
China has urged the U.S. politician to stop provocation, saying Beijing will not allow Washington to cause trouble. At a press briefing, Defense Ministry spokesman Wu Qian said certain U.S. politicians are vainly trying to fuel military conflict. The ministry said it hopes Washington can take measures to create a positive atmosphere for high-level exchanges between their two militaries. Earlier, China's foreign ministry said Washington's sanctions on Chinese companies involved in construction in the South China Sea are unjust. Beijing's statements come after U.S. Defense Secretary Esper said China's growing military spending indicates its global ambitions. Speaking in Hawaii, Esper said Washington is open to working with Beijing to align it with the international rules-based order. The U.S. says scores of its soldiers were injured in northwestern Syria after a Russian military patrol slammed into their vehicle. In a statement, a White House spokesperson said U.S. troops suffered concussive symptoms following the incident. The spokesperson said the unprofessional actions breached the deconfliction protocols that the U.S. and Russia are committed to. He said the coalition and the U.S. do not seek escalation with any military forces. But he said the U.S. forces retain the inherent right and obligation to defend themselves from hostile acts. Meanwhile, a Russian presidential spokesman, Dmitry Peskov, said the U.S. Joint Chiefs of Staff has discussed the matter with the Chief of Russia's General Staff. The U.S. and Russia have military presence in Syria to maintain peace. Protests in the U.S. city of Kenosha in Wisconsin state continue for the fourth night following the shooting of Jacob Blake by a police officer. Demonstrators defied the 2-hour night curfew to hit the streets in eastern Kenosha County.
Violence has occurred throughout the last 3 nights, with buildings set on fire and 2 people killed yesterday. Court officials say a teenager identified as Kyle Rittenhouse has been arrested and charged with homicide. The lakeside city has been rocked by civil unrest, to which President Donald Trump says he is sending federal forces to restore order. In a tweet, Trump said the nation will not stand for looting, arson, violence and lawlessness on American streets. But local media says National Guards are not present in the city's east side where the protesters have gathered. Meanwhile, Wisconsin's Attorney General Josh Call has named the officer who shot Blake. Talking to media, Call said officers found a knife in Blake's car but no other weapons. The Department of Justice has sent over 200 FBI agents and U.S. Marshals to the city as it opens federal investigation into the shooting.
U.S. Vice President Mike Pence has promised to preserve law and order and economic viability on the third night of the Republican National Convention in Baltimore. Pence warned the Americans against electing Democratic presidential candidate Joe Biden. Pence said, contrary to Biden's assertions, economic recovery and law and order were on the ballot, not democracy. He said Biden will do the bidding of the radical left and that the American identity was on the line in the elections. The vice president also slammed Biden over his proposal to reduce funding for the law enforcement, saying Biden's America will not be a safe place. He said U.S. President Donald Trump will always stand with the police against the rioters in Minneapolis, Portland, Kenosha, or anywhere else.
The violence must stop, whether in Minneapolis, Portland, or Kenosha. Too many heroes have died defending our freedom to see Americans strike each other down. We will have law and order on the streets of this country for every American of every race and creed and color.
U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo has met the Sultan of Oman, Haitham bin Tariq Al-Said, during his Middle East tour. The meeting comes following a U.S. brokered deal on normalizing relations between Israel and the United Arab Emirates. Pompeo said he discussed building regional peace, stability and prosperity throughout the region. Oman praised the U.S.-backed accord between the UAE and Israel. Earlier, Israel's intelligence minister said Bahrain and Oman can be the next Gulf Arab countries to formalize ties with Tel Aviv. Before arriving in Oman, Pompeo visited Jerusalem, Sudan, Bahrain and the UAE. Turkey says it is not creating instability in the eastern Mediterranean. In a statement, Turkish Communications Directorate said President Tayyip Erdogan made these remarks in a phone call with U.S. counterpart Donald Trump. The statement said the two leaders discussed bilateral and regional developments, particularly the Mediterranean. It said Erdogan stressed that Turkey proved with concrete actions that it wants to reduce tensions and establish a dialogue on the matter. Meanwhile, Trump has also discussed the matter with Greek Prime Minister Kyriakos Mitsotakis in a separate phone call. The White House said Trump expressed concerns about rising regional tensions. Trump also urged both NATO allies to resolve the dispute through dialogue. 75 people have been killed in an overnight attack by Boko Haram militants in Nigeria's northeastern town of Kawoza. A government official said the militants targeted the town's elderly people in the attack. He said people continue to die every day despite security forces are doing their utmost in the region. The official said the people of the region are facing extreme hunger and the situation will worsen if there is no aid for them. More than 50,000 civilians and security personnel have been killed by Boko Haram terrorists in over a decade. France says the transition towards constitutional order in Mali needs to be quick. Addressing media, Foreign Minister Jean-Yves Le Drian said the French military will continue its operations against the militants in the area. Le Drian said Mali's coup d'etat will not stop the French military's action. The Foreign Minister said power must be returned to the civilians with a political agenda in place so the country can reach stability. He said West African mediation talks had to be concluded quickly because it was indispensable to continue the fight against militants. The leaders of the military coup say they want to stay in power for a 3-year transition period. France has some 5,000 troops in the Sahel region, with a large portion operating from Mali. West African mediators have told Mali's military coup leaders to form a transitional government for a maximum of 12 months. In a statement, Nigeria's presidency said the transitional government must be led by a civilian or a retired military officer. It said the interim government will need to hold elections to restore full constitutional order. This comes after a meeting between Nigerian President Muhammadu Buhari and the head of a delegation from the regional bloc. Meanwhile, the EU has temporarily suspended its training missions in Mali following the coup that ousted President Ibrahim Boubacar Keïta. EU officials said the missions were meant for training Mali's army and police to stabilize the country. NATO has called on Belarus to respect fundamental rights of citizens, including freedom of speech and right to protest. Addressing a press conference in Berlin, Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg said it is up to the people of Belarus to decide their future. Stoltenberg said there is no NATO military buildup in the region. He warned Belarusian authorities against using the alliance as a pretext to launch a crackdown on the protesters.
It is for the people of Belarus to determine their own future. All NATO allies support the sovereign and independent Belarus. The regime in Minsk must demonstrate full respect for fundamental rights, including freedom of speech and the right for peaceful protest. NATO has no military build-up in the region, so any attempt to use that as an excuse to crack down on peaceful protesters is absolutely unjustified.
Germany has called on Russia to help investigate Kremlin critic Alexei Navalny's suspected poisoning. Addressing media, German Foreign Minister Heiko Maas said Russia should join efforts to clear up what happened to Navalny. Maas said the EU foreign ministers will discuss the matter today in a meeting. He said without Russia's help, the bloc will have to decide how to proceed on its own. Meanwhile, NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg and British Prime Minister Boris Johnson have also urged an independent probe into Navalny's incident. Earlier, Berlin's hospital treating Navalny indicated that he had been poisoned days after he was flown from Siberia. The EU's chief Brexit negotiator, Michel Barnier, has called for a deal with Britain on future ties by the end of October. Speaking in Paris, Barnier said a deal must be reached to ensure ratification of a new treaty. The EU negotiator said if conditions allow, he can meet his British counterpart next week. Talks between London and Brussels over post-Brexit ties have made little progress, with both the sides blaming each other for the stalemate. The post-Brexit transition period is expiring on the 31st of December. Human Rights Watch says the Lebanese security forces used excessive force against anti-government protesters after the Beirut port explosion. In a statement, the international rights body has called for an investigation into the abuses. The explosion fueled outrage at the political class already blamed for an economic meltdown. In demonstrations 4 days after the blast, some protesters stormed government ministries and hurled stones at the security forces. The rights group said security forces had fired live ammunition, metal pellets and projectiles such as rubber balls at health workers. It said police deployed excessive quantities of tear gas and security forces threw stones at the protesters and beat them. It says such unlawful force against mostly peaceful protesters show the callous disregard of the authorities for their own people. More stories to follow right after a short break. Stay tuned. Welcome back. The new coronavirus has infected over 24 million people, claiming more than 826,000 lives across the globe. India has recorded its highest ever daily cases with over 75,000 infections, increasing the tally to over 3.3 million. Details in this report.
As the Americas continue to struggle with COVID-19, the virus has also tightened its grip over India, the country of over 1 billion people. While the country breaks the record of new cases every other day, India's death toll has exceeded the 60,000 mark with 1,023 fatalities overnight. In Latin America, Argentina has registered a record daily rise of more than 10,000 infections. While in Peru, healthcare employees protest over working conditions as the country's infection tally crossed 600,000. The U.S. state of California has announced to test 250,000 people for the virus every day.
California is committing to a diagnostic testing partnership that will provide an additional 150,000 tests per day. So we're averaging over 100,000 tests a day. We were doing well north of 130,000 before the wildfires. We'll get back up into that range very shortly. This is additive. It's not a substitute.
In Europe, Ukraine has banned most foreigners until September 28th and extended lockdown measures until the end of October. Germany has banned protests against coronavirus curbs as organizers failed to ensure protective measures would be observed. Whereas despite reporting a new post-lockdown high with cases topping 5,000, France prepares to restart school with mandatory masks.
What everyone must understand in a clear and simple way is that all adults must wear a mask, and children as teenagers must wear it from the first year of the middle school. It is true that in July-August, we thought to set up some exceptions as for assistance in preschool class, or when social distancing was respected for some activities, but we have chosen not to keep those exceptions in order to make the rules clear for everyone.
In Australia, the second most populous state of Victoria has reported its lowest number of daily cases in 2 months, as 113 tested positive overnight. Mainland China recorded only 8 new imported cases and no domestic transmissions. South Korea has recorded over 440 cases overnight, its highest number of daily infections since March.
In Pakistan, the number of active COVID-19 cases continue to fall under the 9,000 mark. The Health Ministry said the recovery rate from the disease is over 94%. The ministry said 445 new cases were reported across the country overnight, taking the toll to over 294,000. It said 6 more people died in the past 24 hours. The nationwide death toll stands at 6,274. Sindh remains the worst hit province, witnessing nearly 129,000 infections, while Punjab has reported over 96,000 cases so far. The toll from the floods triggered by torrential rainfall in Afghanistan's 12 eastern provinces has risen to 150. The Ministry of Disaster Management said 147 people were injured and many others were missing since Tuesday night. The latest casualties come from Kapisa and Panjshir provinces. The ministry data said 1,500 houses and more than 1,000 hectares of agricultural land were destroyed in the floods. A ministry official said search and rescue missions are underway in the flood-hit areas. A spokesman for the President Ashraf Ghani said authorities have been instructed to provide emergency disaster relief to the survivors. Hurricane Laura has made landfall near the American state of Texas and Louisiana as a Category 4 storm. The U.S. National Hurricane Center says the hurricane packed maximum sustained winds of 240 kilometers per hour. The NHC said the storm is currently located about 70 kilometers east of Port Arthur, Texas. The storm is now expected to move inland across southwestern Louisiana. About 620,000 people were under mandatory evacuation orders in Louisiana and Texas, while 103,000 houses in the two states are without power. No casualties have been reported so far in the U.S., whereas at least 23 died in the storm in Haiti before it moved towards the Gulf of Mexico. European markets are trading in negative territory as investors focused on the forthcoming speech by the Federal Reserve's chairman, Jerome Powell. Investors await Fed's new pandemic-era tool to combat the economic impact of COVID-19 and foster inflation in the U.S. The pan-European stock 600 index has fallen a little over 0.25%. Frankfurt's DAX has fallen marginally. London's FTSE 100 has fallen more than 0.25%. Paris's CAC 40 has fallen by 0.5%. Earlier Asian stock markets traded mixed as latest data showed China's economy continued to recover, with a Shenzhen component leading the gains in mainland China. The World Economic Forum says its yearly meeting in Davos has been postponed to the summer of next year. In a statement, the forum's spokesman, Adrian Monk, said the decision was taken following advice from health experts amid the pandemic. Monk said it was not an easy decision since the need for leaders to come together to design the Great Reset in post-pandemic era is so urgent. He said in lieu of the meeting, the forum will host virtual high-level discussions the week of January 25. The announcement came the same day Swiss authorities recorded 383 COVID-19 infections in the last 24 hours. Another weather situation from around the globe. And that is all for now. For the latest updates, you can follow us on social media at Indus.News.